I was recently reviewing some archival footage from a famous psychological study, and I just found myself completely fixated on this one specific participant.
Oh, I think I know the footage you're talking about.
I'm sure you do. He looked like, everyone's favorite grandfather soft features, a worn cardigan, and he was so polite, asking the researchers if he was doing everything correctly.
Just a normal person.
Exactly. You could tell immediately he was a good person. He even got visibly distressed when the stranger in the next room started complaining about a heart condition. He looked at the supervisor with just genuine panic in his eyes.
But that's where it turns.
That's where it turns. Yeah. The authority figure in the lab coat, he didn't yell or threaten him. He just said, in this calm, flat voice, the experiment requires that you continue.
And that was it?
And just like that, the grandfatherly man crumbled. He didn't storm out. He didn't refuse. Instead, he turned the dial up. He administered what he believed were lethal electric shocks to an innocent man, all while sweating and trapped in this state of polite paralysis.
That scene is terrifying.
It's terrifying, not because the man was some hidden monster, he clearly hated what he was doing, but because he was so terrifyingly normal. He wasn't driven by malice, he was driven by the inability to break a social contract.
Right.
It forces us to confront this brutal reality. The line between a good person and someone who does something awful isn't always about character.
Yeah.
A lot of the time, it's just about circumstance. So how does the psychology of doing your job turn ordinary people into agents of evil? And more importantly, how do we build the mental defense systems to stop ourselves from sliding down that same slope?
That is the absolute core question for our deep dive today. We are moving well beyond that simplistic and frankly comforting idea of the bad apple.
The idea that it's just a few bad people out there.
Exactly. The notion that societal evil only resides in a few inherently flawed individuals. Instead, we're going to look at the bad barrel, the organizational, the systemic, and the cognitive architecture that compels morally upright people to override their internal compass.
So it's the system, not just the person.
It's the system. Our mission today is a deep investigation into how these psychological mechanisms like obedience and rationalization, how they interact with external pressures to just actively erode moral integrity. We want to understand modern wrongdoing, where it's less about some monstrous individual malice and far more about bureaucratic compliance.
It's chilling then to think that one of the most famous psychological inquiries into human morality was born directly out of, well, a historical attempt to understand mass atrocity. The Milgram experiments conducted in the early 1960s, they didn't happen in a vacuum, did they?
Not at all. Stanley Milgram conceived these studies just 3 months after the trial of the Nazi war criminal Adolf Eichmann started in Jerusalem.
Right, Eichmann, the man who organized the logistics of the Holocaust.
The very same. And Eichmann didn't present as this, slavering sadist. He claimed almost tediously that he was just a functionary. He was an obedient civil servant.
He was just following orders.
The ultimate defense. The entire world was asking, was this claim of superior orders a legitimate psychological reality, or was it just a convenient legal excuse? Milgram wanted to find out if ordinary people, when you place them under the umbrella of institutional authority, would they actually carry out actions that went against their deepest moral code?
And the experimental design itself was, it was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. It had to be convincing for the subject to genuinely believe they were administering lethal pain.
It was meticulous. In every single session, you had 3 primary roles. There was the experimenter, the authority figure, always in a serious lab coat. We can call him E.
The one giving the orders.
Yep. Then you had the true subject, the volunteer, who was designated the teacher, T. And finally, the learner, L, who was in on it the whole time. He was an actor.
The cover story was brilliantly simple, right? A study on memory and learning.
Deceptively so. A scientific study of memory and learning, investigating the effect of punishment on memorization. The roles were fixed, though the subjects were told they were randomly assigned. But the crucial element here was the perceived authority of the setting, the esteemed Yale University, and the scientific nature of the task.
So the teacher, the subject, would watch as the learner was strapped into a chair in the next room, supposedly to stop him from escaping during the shocks.
Right.
But the real centerpiece of the whole deception was the shock generator itself. What made that machine so effective at persuading people?
It looked, sounded, and felt completely real. The generator panel had 30 different voltage switches, starting at 15 volts and going up incrementally. It had these really clear verbal labels, escalating from slight shock to moderate, then danger, severe shock, all the way up to 450 volts.
So you could see exactly what you were supposedly doing.
The visual and textual escalation was a huge part of the subject's anxiety and their conviction that this was real. But the most critical part, and it's often overlooked, was the sample shock.
Ah, so they felt it themselves.
Before the experiment officially began, the teacher was given a low-level shock from the generator. This was a non-negotiable step to make the entire process visceral and credible. Having felt that sting themselves, the teachers were convinced that every single time they flipped a switch, the learner was experiencing real, escalating pain.
And when the teacher inevitably hesitated, maybe around 75 volts when the learner first grunted, or later when he began pleading to be released, the experimenter had a series of these carefully scripted, non-emotional prods.
And they were designed not to threaten, but simply to reiterate the authority and the necessity of the procedure. Things like, please continue.
The experiment requires that you continue.
It is absolutely essential that you continue. And then the final, most uncompromising prod. You have no other choice, you must go on. The lack of emotion in the delivery was so key. It made the command sound like a procedural necessity, not like personal malice.
So, before running these trials, Milgram asked Yale psychology majors and psychiatrists to predict the results. What did the experts think would happen?
The predictions were, well, they were staggeringly wrong. The experts, people professionally trained to understand human behavior and ethics, they believed that only a tiny fraction, about 0.1% of subjects, would administer the maximum, clearly labeled danger, severe shock of 450 volts.
0.1%. Basically nobody.
Practically no one. They expected almost everyone to stop around 150 volts, which was the point where the victim first explicitly demanded to be let out and complained of pain.
That prediction just reveals this fundamental misunderstanding of the power of authority, because the reality was horrifyingly different.
It really was. 65% of the participants went all the way up to the full 450 volts.
65. That's almost 2/3.
And critically, every single participant went up to at least 300 volts. That was the level where the actor, the learner, would emit this final dramatic scream before falling completely silent.
And we really can't stress this enough. These were not sadistic people. The evidence of their conflict is overwhelming.
It's so crucial to remember that. The films and the transcripts, they detail this profound internal struggle. Subjects were sweating profusely, they were trembling, stuttering, groaning, pulling on their ears. Some of them even developed these nervous laughing fits, or, in a few extreme cases, had seizures.
They were in agony over it.
They were desperate to stop, yet they felt incapable of resisting the calm procedural authority standing right next to them. This conflict proved the agentic state was being achieved, but at a huge personal cost.
So Milgram coined this term, Agentic State Theory, to explain this transition. If someone is so clearly struggling morally, how does the agentic state allow them to just keep flipping that switch?
The theory centers on what he called a critical shift in cognitive processing. The individual stops viewing themselves as an autonomous moral actor, someone whose actions have direct personal consequences.
They sort of outsource their conscience.
That's a great way to put it. They see themselves as an instrument or an agent executing the wishes of the authority figure. They shift from a state of autonomy to the agentic state. The moment the subject sees themselves as just a cog in the machine, they surrender personal responsibility.
They believe the experimenter, the authority, is the one who's truly responsible.
Exactly. They believe the experimenter bears the moral and legal burden for the outcome. Their function is reduced to just carrying out the procedure, which is far less mentally taxing than resisting authority and bearing the moral burden of causing harm yourself.
And what's fascinating here is that the physical context, the actual environment, had an immediate and measurable impact on this state.
Absolutely. Milgram ran numerous variations that revealed the structural factors that either strengthen or weaken that psychological bind. For instance, he tested the impact of perceived institutional authority.
Right, he moved it from Yale.
He moved the experiment from the highly prestigious Yale campus to a modest, unregistered office in a rundown building in Bridgeport. And compliance dropped from 65% down to 47.5%. The prestige of the environment provides a layer of moral justification for the authority's demands.
But the truly telling variables were all about proximity, the physical distance from both the authority and the victim.
Precisely. Compliance dropped significantly when the experimenter's authority was weakened by distance. If the experimenter gave instructions over the telephone instead of standing right there next to the teacher, the agentic state was much harder to maintain.
And what happened to the numbers?
Compliance plummeted to 21%. Many subjects just straight up lied to the experimenter over the phone, claiming they were following orders when they actually weren't.
And what about the other way, getting closer to the victim?
Conversely, increasing the proximity to the victim's pain also made the agentic state unsustainable. In one variation, the teacher was required to physically hold the learner's hand down onto the shock plate. And that personalization, that direct physical proximity to the consequence of the action, it broke the agentic bond for many. Compliance dropped down to 30%. The farther you are, psychologically and physically, from the consequences of your action, the easier it is to surrender responsibility.
This insight into the surrender of responsibility is exactly what we see play out in real-world institutional settings. I mean, you think about the story of Sarah, the correctional officer. Her experience is just a devastating parallel to the Milgram subjects.
Sarah was, by all accounts, a conscientious person, a mother who cared deeply about others. But she took a job at a private juvenile detention center, and she stepped into an environment that was immediately defined by a severe, structured hierarchy.
And she was immediately immersed in rhetoric that dehumanized the inmates.
Immediately. The shift commander and the training staff systematically referred to the detainees as super predators and threats, not as troubled teenagers. They were already framing them as less than human.
So when a riot broke out, the pressure just peaked. The commander, this symbol of absolute authority, ordered the officers to teach them a lesson and directed Sarah to use excessive force on a restrained teenager. Sarah clearly felt a profound moral collapse, yet she did it. Why did she override that distress?
This is a textbook manifestation of the agentic state, and it's facilitated by that institutional pressure. When she was asked about it later, Sarah argued that the commander had given the direct order which made the commander the person who bore the sole responsibility.
She saw herself as an instrument.
A loyal employee executing institutional policy under duress, the very definition of the displacement of responsibility that Milgram outlined. And furthermore, the moral injury was enabled beforehand by the environment. The constant use of that dehumanizing language calling inmates threats had already primed her system to see them as deserving of it.
So, if the agentic state is the surrender responsibility, the next phase of our discussion has to detail the comprehensive cognitive toolkit that allows a person to sustain that state without suffering crushing guilt. We need to look at the 8 psychological mechanisms of moral disengagement.
That's right. Moral disengagement, a concept heavily advanced by the psychologist Albert Bandura, is the overarching psychological process. It's the mental gymnastics that allow a person to separate their inherent moral reactions, their sense of right and wrong, from inhumane or destructive conduct.
It lets them do bad things without feeling like a bad person.
Precisely. It permits people to engage in behavior that contradicts their internal values without suffering self-condemnation. It is essentially the art of cognitive reframing.
Okay, so let's look at the first mechanism, which often acts as the entry point: moral justification.
Moral justification is about converting a harmful act into a perceived good. The reprehensible behavior is reframed as serving some higher moral, social, or beneficial purpose. By defining an unethical action as necessary and noble, you completely neutralize the moral conflict.
And this is pervasive across so many fields, from warfare to politics. We see it in the justification of torture.
Absolutely. The use of enhanced interrogation or torture is often justified through the ticking time bomb scenario, right? The argument that saving thousands of lives via intelligence gathering trumps the moral violation of torturing one person. The utility, the higher good of national security, condones the immoral means.
And on a massive scale, religious warfare provides chilling examples.
Perpetrators of holy terror, whether we're talking about the Crusades or modern groups like ISIS, they twist religious doctrine into a divine mandate. They genuinely believe they are not committing murder, but rather carrying out a righteous action or cleansing the world in the name of God. Killing becomes a virtue.
Even within our own legal systems, the death penalty is often justified by appealing to retributivism, the proportional principle of an eye for an eye, or through utility, by claiming it serves as a deterrent.
Exactly. The executioners themselves often articulate their role in terms of deterrence, believing they're saving future lives by performing their duty. They justify their act of killing as an act of public service, and that conversion from killing to service is the key psychological leverage.
Okay, so from there we move to the second mechanism, euphemistic labeling.
Right. If moral justification converts the act into a good, euphemistic labeling simply obscures it using sanitized, professional, or academic language. This linguistic camouflage prevents your prefrontal cortex from flagging the act as morally problematic.
The military is famously adept at this. Killing people becomes wasting them. Bombing campaigns aren't destructive. They are servicing the target or visiting a site, which sounds like a maintenance job.
It creates distance. Dead civilians are flattened into the clinical term collateral damage. The emotional and visceral impact of the word murder is completely neutralized by phrases like force packages. Secret CIA detention facilities become black sites. Illegal surveillance becomes the Patriot Act.
And in corporate settings, this sanitization is just rampant.
Oh, everywhere. Volkswagen didn't install illegal defeat devices. They implemented an acoustic function.
An acoustic function.
Job dismissals are framed as career alternative enhancement. And in the Watergate scandal, the criminal conspiracy was called a game plan, carried out by team players. They borrowed jargon from sports to lend a veneer of legitimate enterprise to crimes.
It's amazing how language transforms intent. If I call something creative structuring instead of fraud, my mind processes it as less harmful.
Exactly. That is the crucial function of euphemisms. They protect the perpetrator's self-concept as a moral agent because the act, as you've labeled it, just doesn't sound harmful.
Yeah, the third mechanism leverages relativity. Advantageous comparison.
Right. You exploit the contrast principle by comparing your harmful act against something much worse. If you can define the context as everyone else is worse, your own behavior suddenly seems trivial, or maybe even beneficial.
So, if a pesticide company is responsible for a few fatalities, they can deflect criticism by arguing that more people die annually from aspirin misuse and bee stings.
It shifts the focus. Their products' fatalities are, relatively speaking, benign. Or another classic example is global political inaction. When the U.S. rejected the Kyoto Protocol, they compared their own emissions to those of developing countries which were exempted from caps. They felt righteous in rejecting the obligation because others weren't doing enough.
Comparative exoneration.
It allows both sides to feel morally superior while avoiding responsibility for the broader collective harm.
Now we arrive back at the mechanism that's so central to the Milgram experiment, the displacement of responsibility.
This is the vertical shift we talked about. Obscuring personal accountability by placing the blame squarely on the authority figures who issued the orders. The subordinate sees themselves as merely carrying out orders. But what happens when the authorities themselves want to duck responsibility?
They employ systemic tools.
Exactly, like willful blindness.
Tell us more about willful blindness and how that functions institutionally.
Willful blindness is when authorities intentionally structure the environment so they can remain uninformed, which gives them plausible deniability of wrongdoing. They create these opaque, mazy chains of authorization.
Like the CEO of Volkswagen.
A perfect example. He claimed complete ignorance that his company had developed and installed illegal emissions devices. The senior leadership permits deniability by setting these aspirational goals without ever asking how they're achieved. It's the just get the deal and don't tell me how you got it mindset.
And this allows low-level actors to displace responsibility onto the system, and high-level actors to displace responsibility onto the subordinates who perform the action.
It creates a total vacuum of accountability. You see it in the tragedy of the Catholic Church officials who would pass evidence of child molesting priests up the chain of command and then feel like they had fulfilled their role.
Right, they just passed the buck.
Precisely. The lower-level officials felt their moral duty was simply to report, not to follow up. One official explicitly stated, "I don't think it was my role to follow through." The structure allows them to check a box and disengage.
And if displacement shifts responsibility vertically, the fifth mechanism, diffusion of responsibility, spreads it out horizontally across a group.
This is the bureaucratic nightmare of modern systems, where no single individual feels like they made the choice to inflict harm.
It's everyone's fault, so it's no one's fault.
That's the psychological key. When the harmful act is distributed across a collective, individual accountability is minimized. The best example is the division of labor and capital punishment. Imagine the execution team. The functional arrangement assigns each individual only a small, specific task. One member straps the left leg, another the right arm, a third adjusts the monitor. A guard involved in strapping down offenders 126 times for the electric chair argued, quote, "I never pulled the trigger, I wasn't the executioner."
Because his role was so discreet, he felt no personal moral burden.
None at all. And this extends to corporate behavior, like price-fixing conspiracies. In cases involving electrical manufacturers, the collusion was achieved through group decision-making. The smaller firms involved often felt their individual vote was too unimportant to influence the overall scheme.
You can also think of the vast network involved in the tobacco industry.
A huge network. It requires chemists who increase the nicotine kick, biotech researchers genetically engineering high nicotine leaves, executives denying health effects, and advertisers targeting youth. No single person feels responsible for the 500,000 deaths annually. It is a diffused institutional function.
Okay, next up, we have disregarding or misrepresenting consequences. This seems to be about neutralizing the harm after the fact, or before it's even perceived.
Right. If the consequences are deemed remote, invisible, or trivial, there's no moral issue to contend with. The core strategy here is sowing doubt, and it's perfectly summarized by the tobacco industry's famous internal memo. Doubt is our product since it is the best means of competing with the body of fact that exists in the mind of the general public.
They couldn't refute the science, so they just manufactured controversy.
And when the evidence is undeniable, they shift to trivializing the harm. The coal industry proclaiming global warming a hoax. The silica industry minimizing the seriousness of silicosis by stating that nuisance dust exposures were more injurious to the mechanical equipment than to workmen.
Or when the military refused to count civilian casualties in the Iraq War, saying, "We don't do body counts."
They made the harm abstract and unverifiable. Any time the detrimental results of an action are remote, a drone pilot firing a missile from thousands of miles away, or a financial analyst selling a toxic derivative to a client they will never meet, it becomes infinitely easier to disregard the consequences. Distance is the friend of moral disengagement.
The seventh mechanism, dehumanization, is arguably the most brutal because it targets the victim's inherent worth.
Dehumanization strips victims of their human qualities, rendering them subhuman objects. The psychological mechanism is really simple. Perceiving another human activates empathy and self-censure. If you can define the victim as an object, an animal, or a demon, your moral compass is automatically silenced toward them.
Moral concern is just deactivated.
Completely. We see this in language used by terrorists and extremists, calling opponents rats, cockroaches, or dogs.
It's universally effective across so many contexts.
The Nazi genocide relied on portraying Jews in demeaning animalistic caricatures before stripping them of their identity and assigning them numbers. At Abu Ghraib, Iraqi detainees were forced to wear leashes and crawl like dogs, with guards justifying the abuse by saying, "Look what these animals do when you leave them alone for 2 seconds."
And even in high finance.
Even there, traders who manipulated clients referred to them as muppets, stupid, easily manipulated people. One salesman even bragged about targeting widows and orphans, which are Wall Street euphemisms for unsuspecting, vulnerable investors. Dehumanization allows for moral exclusion. It removes the victim from your sphere of moral consideration entirely.
Finally, we have the eighth mechanism, attribution of blame.
This flips the script entirely. You blame the victims for bringing the harsh treatment upon themselves by their own behavior. This maneuver turns the perpetrator into a faultless victim who is driven to injurious actions by provocation.
The examples here are deeply disturbing because they reveal this cultural tendency to blame the weak.
Consider the lead industry, which tried to deflect responsibility for lead poisoning. Instead of blaming their product, they claimed that children with high lead levels suffered from a disease called pica, or had subnormal appetites, where they just blamed ignorant parents.
It's also rampant in cases of sexual violence.
Very common. Rapists often shift blame, arguing the victim was flirting, drinking, or dressing provocatively, implying that the victim asked for it. Even within institutional structures, like some church officials dealing with sexual abuse, they would sometimes claim the youngster is the seducer. Attribution of blame is a powerful protective shield because it allows the perpetrator to claim moral rectitude while inflicting harm.
It's clear that these 8 mechanisms work in concert, creating this psychological cascade. This incremental ethical erosion is perfectly demonstrated by Elias, the high-speed trading analyst. Tell us about his path.
Elias started out with clear ideals, working at this prestigious, high-pressure firm. And his ethical descent was a slow, subtle normalization of deviance. It began when a charismatic leader asked him to make a small, seemingly benign adjustment. Adjust the projection parameters to be slightly more optimistic for a client presentation.
Just a little tweak.
Just a little one. Elias initially resisted internally, but he mentally reframed the action as a moral justification. He told himself he was performing a benevolent act to protect clients from panic selling in a volatile market. He wasn't lying. He was stabilizing the situation for their own good.
And once that initial justification was made, the next deviation became exponentially easier.
Exactly. 3 months later, the pressure shifted from protecting clients to protecting the firm's bonuses and his team's standing. The environment of results at all costs normalized this behavior. Elias stopped calling the action lying or fraud and started referring to it as creative structuring or optimizing disclosures.
Textbook euphemistic labeling.
And that cemented the ethical compromise. He was now able to continue the deceptive act without suffering the initial pangs of guilt. By the time the firm's misconduct was discovered, Elias genuinely felt like a loyal employee who had simply been doing what the job and the culture demanded.
So it shows the problem wasn't some hidden monster inside Elias, but a culture acting as a bad barrel, tacitly rewarding moral disengagement.
And redefining unethical acts as business necessity.
This transition leads us directly into our third phase. We have to shift focus from the individual toolkit to the architecture that enables this ethical erosion, the structure of the organization itself.
If the individual utilizes the mechanisms of moral disengagement, the organization provides the fertile ground for those mechanisms to thrive. Organizational culture is a living, breathing system defined not just by the HR handbook, but by the unspoken norms, the stories, and the responses to crisis.
And unethical cultures are characterized by an absence of something.
An absence of critical reflection, an absence of perspective-taking, and a failure to challenge toxic leadership. And culture is fragile. It degrades much faster than it's built.
So let's break down the ethical ecosystem across 5 distinct levels, starting with the individual level, how the organizational structure interacts with the worker.
The individual level is the battleground of incentives. And the core dilemma is what you could call the ethical conundrum. The behaviors that are highly prized in competitive marketplaces, things like aggressiveness, singular focus, creativity, they're often the same traits that lead to non-compliance.
And the danger spikes when incentives are unrealistic or focus only on outcomes.
Exactly. When you focus solely on quantifiable outcomes, growth, profit, market share, to the exclusion of how that outcome is achieved. The classic example is the scandal at Wells Fargo. Employees were relentlessly pressured to meet these aspirational goals of selling 8 accounts per customer, goals that management knew were often impossible.
The pressure wasn't just administrative, it was about survival.
It was intense. Employees who failed to hit these unsustainable targets were often disciplined or fired. When the penalty for failure is losing your job, employees will rationally choose to create the unauthorized accounts, the ethical compromise, rather than lose their livelihood. The culture made deviation the necessary survival strategy.
So the solution isn't just punishing bad behavior.
It's building incentives that reward ethical behavior alongside achievement. And promoting diversity and inclusion is a big part of the solution here, which might seem counterintuitive.
How so?
It's vital. Diversity ensures employees feel safe bringing their whole selves, including their unique moral identity, to work. If employees feel pressure to conform to some homogeneous, competitive, dominant culture, they're much less likely to align their personal values with the organization's stated mission and way less likely to voice ethical concerns.
Moving to the second level, the interpersonal hierarchy, this is where the abuse of power really manifests.
Unethical cultures thrive in highly hierarchical structures marked by arrogance, complacency, or leader opacity. When leaders operate with that "just get the deal and don't tell me how you got it" mindset, they are actively facilitating displacement and willful blindness among their subordinates.
Employees quickly learn that performance matters more than principle.
They do. And if promotions and rewards seem politically motivated or unfair, the organizational values are rendered completely meaningless.
So how do you solve a problem that's rooted in the abuse of entrenched power?
You need robust protection systems and visible ethical modeling. You have to ensure meaningful protections for all employees through effective whistleblowing and grievance mechanisms. Employees often stay silent not because they lack courage, but because they fear retribution or they believe speaking up is futile.
And leaders have to model the right behavior.
They must actively model it. This means they can't rely on plausible deniability. They have to engage personally with operational challenges and seek out what is actually happening on the ground, especially in high-pressure or remote divisions.
Okay, the third level is the group-team dynamic, which dictates the immediate daily work climate.
The team is the most powerful socializing force. In an unethical culture, roles might be contradictory or unclear, which generates anxiety that makes individuals cling to the group consensus rather than their own independent moral assessment. New employees get rapidly socialized into a deviant subculture where, for example, fraud is normalized through institutional stories and euphemistic group jargon.
The solution here centers heavily on something called psychological safety. What exactly does that look like in practice for an ethical team?
Psychological safety is the crucial differentiator. It's the ability to take interpersonal risks, to raise a concern, to admit a mistake, or to challenge a group norm without fear of humiliation or retribution.
And in unethical teams?
In unethical teams associated with corporate misconduct, the culture is often characterized by in-group language, metaphors of war, and a total intolerance for failure. In contrast, an ethically safe team models curiosity, shares challenges openly, and encourages questions. This climate reduces the anxiety that forces people into the agentic state.
So if I know my team leader will back me up for pausing a dangerous launch, I'm much more likely to maintain my moral agency.
Much more likely. And clarity in roles and tasks helps too, ensuring team members know exactly where their moral and professional boundaries lie.
Scaling up to the fourth level, the intergroup dynamic, which focuses on the relationships between different departments or teams.
The boundaries between groups can be hazardous. If they're too rigid, a team resists all external oversight. It can create a corrupt silo, especially if that team is high-performing and led by highly incentivized people. The organization might even undermine its own values by celebrating high-performing teams whose success clearly stems from questionable conduct.
And this is a failure of oversight.
A huge failure. Teams specifically tasked with ethical monitoring, like audit, compliance, sustainability, they often struggle for respect, resources, and influence within the internal hierarchy.
The General Motors ignition switch scandal is such a sobering example of how intergroup failure leads to disaster.
It's tragic. The problem wasn't just a defect, it was a systemic failure of accountability across multiple working groups. Internal cross-functional groups were tasked with investigating the issue, but accountability was so diffused that no single person or department took ownership of the crisis.
So engineers knew there was a flaw, but the problem was minimized by legal teams and executives,
who relied on intergroup boundaries and complex organizational charts to avoid definitive action. The result was years of delay and avoidable deaths. The solution has to involve aligning oversight teams under senior leadership and actively discussing the differing values across groups, like the values of the engineering department versus the sales department, to ensure transparency.
Finally, the fifth level, interorganizational. This is how the company interacts with the external world.
And employees are watching. They are acutely aware of the disconnect between the company's stated mission and its actions towards its stakeholders, suppliers, customers, and society. An unethical culture is typically obsessed with growth at all costs, promoting hyper-competitive relationships and believing the ends always justify the means.
We see this hypocrisy when companies claim sustainability is in our DNA, but then refuse to sacrifice even marginal profit for genuinely ethical sourcing.
That gap, that inconsistency, is corrosive to internal ethics. The ultimate task here is building and maintaining authentic stakeholder trust. This means the organization must demonstrate a willingness to make financial trade-offs in some circumstances to ensure the ethical messaging is consistent and authentic.
Because if the organization never compromises profit, employees know that the ethical claims are hollow.
Which further validates their own use of moral disengagement. The how of growth must be as important as the whether of growth.
So we've broken down the system and the psychological toolkit. Now for the most important part, the defense. We need to look at how we build the individual resilience to successfully resist authority and systemic pressure.
The ability to resist orders to inflict harm is not just a sign of high moral character, it requires a specific type of cognitive distancing. And recent neurocognitive research has shed some light on what actually happens in the brain when someone successfully disobeys a harmful order.
So we're moving beyond just personality traits and into the actual cognitive mechanics of resistance.
Exactly. One fascinating study found that successful resistance was associated with specific patterns of brain activity. Specifically, participants who successfully refused an authoritative order showed a reduction in the frontal midline theta rhythm activity in the brain.
That sounds like some serious jargon. Can you unpack what that means for us?
Think of the theta rhythm as the brainwave associated with processing control and monitoring conflicts. It's often tied to attention and execution. When the brain shows lower theta rhythm activity during a moment of resistance, it suggests the person is actively disengaging attention from the authoritative command.
So they're literally tuning out the voice of authority in their heads.
Instead of prioritizing the instruction itself, they are focusing on the consequence or their own internal moral distress. And further research into personality traits associated with this, pro-social disobedience, confirmed this. Resistance was reliably linked to a high score on the harm subscale of the Moral Foundation questionnaire.
Meaning that people who strongly value the moral foundation of avoiding harm are much more likely to disobey when commanded to injure someone.
Regardless of the perceived authority level, it suggests that resistance is a muscle we can train, which brings us to Philip Zimbardo's concept of the heroic imagination.
The heroic imagination.
It's a crucial, practiced mental framework. It is the preparation for those inevitable high-stakes moments where ethical compromise is required. Most people succumb to pressure not out of malice, but because they're caught off guard and trapped by the binding factors. The immediate social pressure, the fear of awkwardness, the anxiety of being perceived poorly.
So heroic imagination means mentally rehearsing moral action before the situation even happens.
It's about creating a cognitive firewall that allows you to reframe the social cost. Being awkward, being fired, as trivial compared to the moral cost of inflicting harm.
Let's translate this into concrete, practical steps you can take to cultivate this resilience, to build your personal ethical defense system.
The first step is to develop situational awareness. You need to proactively scan your environment for subtle pressures. When you're asked to perform an action, don't just default to obedience. Slow down your instinctive thinking, your system one, and engage your rational brain. Ask, who specifically benefits from this action? What are the potential long-term consequences, and who might be hurt?
That slowing down is key. The second step tackles the entire toolkit of disengagement. Prevent moral disengagement.
You have to police your internal language. Consciously monitor your thoughts to catch yourself using euphemisms that distance you from responsibility. If you find yourself thinking it's just policy or I had no choice, you have to immediately counter that thought by asserting your agency, I chose this action.
By consciously accepting responsibility, you counteract the rationalization.
You preserve your self-image as a moral agent, which makes it much harder to inflict harm without internal suffering.
Step 3 addresses the core Milgram finding. Question authority thoughtfully.
This doesn't mean rejecting every boss or policy, but establishing a clear mental distinction between just authority based on competence and wisdom and unjust authority, which is based purely on coercion or position. Ask yourself, does my compliance serve a greater good that aligns with my values, or does it just serve someone else's narrow, potentially destructive interest?
The fourth step speaks directly to the agentic state. Maintain individual identity.
You must resist being reduced to a cog in the corporate or institutional machine. The moment you define yourself only by your assigned role, I am just a strapped-down team member or I am just a salesman, you forfeit your moral agency. You have to assert your unique moral identity, reminding yourself of your values and your humanity. That assertion acts as a vital barrier against slipping into that state.
And finally, the fifth step, which is about building the necessary muscle strength. Practice moral courage.
Moral courage is not an innate trait. It's a muscle that atrophies without use. You have to start small. Address low-stakes injustices in your daily life, speaking up about minor policy issues or supporting someone when it's uncomfortable but not professionally dangerous. These small acts compound over time, making your moral muscle stronger and your internal voice louder, preparing you for when the high-stakes moment arrives.
The power of this mental preparation is perfectly illustrated by the story of Kenji, the mid-level engineer.
Kenji was under unimaginable organizational pressure. His company was just days away from a massive product launch, an expensive, globally advertised automotive launch. A delay meant millions in losses, professional shame, and likely career stagnation for his team.
And he's found a flaw.
A microscopic stress fracture and a critical brake component. His manager, already overwhelmed, urged him to sign off, arguing it was within the margin of error. The entire team was focused on celebrating, and the pressure for immediate social approval was just immense.
Most people in that scenario would sign off, displacing responsibility upward or euphemistically labeling the flaw as acceptable variance, but Kenji refused.
Kenji was able to resist because he had actively utilized the heroic imagination. He had mentally rehearsed this moment, not necessarily this exact scenario, but the scenario of being asked to compromise safety for profit. He consciously prioritized the long-term ethical consequences.
You didn't just see a spreadsheet and a deadline.
He visualized the face of a stranger driving that car with their family inside. By consciously prioritizing the avoidance of harm over immediate social approval and organizational demands, he broke those psychological binding factors. His uncomfortable no illustrates that ethical resilience is often quiet, bureaucratic, and painful. It requires the conscious training of the brain to maintain moral agency in the face of systemic coercion. Our deep dive into Milgram's findings, the comprehensive mechanisms of moral disengagement, and the analysis of corrosive organizational culture. It all leads to a single, sobering conclusion. The true battle against atrocity is not against external monsters. It's against the powerful, often invisible forces of social structure, obedience, and self-justification that transform ordinary, good individuals into instruments of harm. Evil, in the modern context, often wears the mask of normalcy, efficiency, and bureaucratic procedure.
The ultimate task of ethical living is not to be born good, but to learn how to actively disobey the invisible pressures that coerce us toward harm. A resilience that requires conscious, continuous effort against the powerful psychological currents of moral compromise.